a gorgeous recipe for today. Today's recipe is bread, basic bread. I was sitting here going through my notes and some of the things that I have done over the years when it comes to bread making. You know, throughout my life, which I've always had an interest in cooking. There have been times when I did a different push based on certain ingredients or certain types of cooking that I wanted to learn. And so I would invest my time and efforts into my own growth and making myself stronger in the kitchen. And the first time I tried working on bread and really making it and being very sincere about getting it made was actually in the 70s. And then there was another time, I think in the 90s, and then again like 2003, 2002, right in there. And here we are, we've come full circle again. But the experiments are over. All of the different things that I have done are over. And I did a lot of experiments. I did experiments on how changing yeast quantity affects a base recipe, how changing the sugar quantity affects a base recipe, how those two being changed will affect a recipe, how salt is used both in flavoring as well as in slowing down yeast growth, and also in different hydration levels and what they bring. And that's what I want to share today, to show you what can be done in basic bread making. Okay, so it's a basic recipe, but today we're going to discuss a few of the nuances of bread making that is going to take you from just learning this, if you're just learning bread making for the first time, or if you're kind of intermediate and you got a lot of questions. I'll bet money I'm going to answer a lot of questions for you today, because we're going to talk about hydration levels, the texture on the inside of the bread, and how to get finer texture or a more coarse texture. They call that the crumb, by the way. And also how to get different types of crust, hard crunchy crust, soft crust. I'll be discussing that in today's video. So we're going to get into making a basic white bread recipe. And this is as basic as I know white bread to be. The only more basic recipe than this, which isn't really called white bread, it's called a French baguette. That is the most simple of all recipes that I know of yeast risen breads. And that recipe is simply flour, water, salt, and yeast. Those four ingredients. Today we're going to take those four ingredients and add sugar to it. The sugar is going to increase the speed of the rise. It's going to change the flavor of the dough slightly, and the way we set our hydration level will determine how the texture on the inside of the bread comes out. I'll show you how that works. Very simple recipe. Let's get into making this thing. Come on over, we'll get this stuff measured out. The ingredients we're using today, 5 ingredients. Very simple recipe. We have flour, sugar, salt, yeast, and water. Now, this is a white bread recipe, and frequently white bread recipes will have milk in them. If you wish to use milk for this, you can. There's not a problem. You can use something even with a higher fat content, like half and half, and it does lend to the bread. All right, so don't be afraid to make changes as you wish. After all, this recipe is to be basic white bread recipe. You can turn this into rolls, you can turn it into pizza dough or whatever you want it to be, or just a plain loaf. And as far as what you're going to cook that thing in, loaf pans. Whether it's a fancy loaf pan or just a basic loaf pan, that's what we're using, folks. It doesn't matter. Okay, so choose you a loaf pan and go with it. I do recommend any loaf pan needs something on it to keep you from sticking. So a fancy one you're going to have to use some spray on. A basic one you can rub butter on it, or you can just rub some shortening on that. Anything that'll keep that loaf from sticking initially. We're not going to have a really sticky bread this time, but it'll be slightly sticky. We don't want it too dry, but I am looking for a smooth, even grain on the what they call the crumb, which is the texture of the bread. So I'm not wanting it to be too sticky. The wetter the bread is, the more you're going to see those larger pockets of air inside of the bread. The drier it is, the more even and smooth the crumb will be. You know, I'm fortunate enough that I have a mixer to mix up stuff like this. Not everybody has one of these. You don't have to have one of these. If all you have is a mixing bowl and a spatula, or the handle of a spoon, a wooden spoon will work, or just a plain metal spoon, anything that will stir the dough is good enough, all right? After it's stirred together, it's a matter of kneading it, and that can be done by hand. And that's where the machine is nice. If you don't want to have to invest your hand labor in this and you own one of these things, if it came with a dough hook, hey, it's time for us to put it to use. This is a single loaf recipe, so it is a really easy thing to do by hand if you want to. I wanted to mention for a moment, before we get started on the recipe, the stuff that you use to make the recipe work. All right. Now, I have my ingredients out here. It's nice if you have a thermometer. You can check that water temperature. But if you want, you can just put your finger down in there. I'm showing 113 degrees, which is just about right. By the time it hits my bowl, it'll be cooled down enough. I'm looking for 105 to 110. Perfect temperature for yeast. The pan you use, we're going to use a pan. You can use basic loaf pan. You can use a fancy loaf pan if you happen to have one. Feel free to experiment, but this is best done in some sort of a pan like this. Something with tall sides, a basic loaf pan is perfect, and that's what we have here. I'm going to be using just the basic design today. All right, plain rectangular pan. Bowls. Bowls do matter, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we're going to be mixing this in this metal bowl. But I want to tell you right now, yeast and metal do not get along with each other. They don't like each other, all right? Metal will retard the growth of yeast, plain and simple. So when it comes to rising the dough, make sure you use either plastic, glass, or ceramic, anything other than a metal bowl, okay? Plain and simple. Now the glass I like to use because I can see what's going on behind it. And when I use two bowls like this, instead of putting a towel over one, I can simply invert one bowl over the other. It gives me enough room so it can rise up above the size of the bowl. And if I want, it allows me to see what's going on underneath there. It's just kind of a neat way of doing it. If you happen to have to, give it a try. So there it is. We're going to get on with mixing this up. We're going to start by getting our yeast mixed into the water. And I want to discuss that also. When it comes to making bread, modern yeast, as long as it's in date, you can pretty much be rest assured it's going to work fine. But it used to be people didn't want to waste their ingredients, and they would do what's called proofing the yeast. Take your yeast and the sugar and mix them with the water, and if it starts to foam up after about 10 minutes or so, then you've got active yeast there and a perfect thing to put it down for making your bread. All right. I'm going to just mix the stuff together and then start adding in my flour. I already know my yeast is good, all right, because I've used another package of this exact strip of packets just a couple of weeks ago. It's a good yeast. This is very simple. The one thing I want to caution you is never mix the salt directly into your yeast. So I would say add the salt a little further along in the mixing, all right? Just don't put it directly against it in the water because salt retards the growth of yeast, all right? Plain and simple. So let's start with our water. Oh yes, I'm going to put some sugar in this water, get that dissolved. There we go. Let's get the yeast right down in there. So here's the thing. When it comes to bread texture and the flour that we make bread with, the flours vary from season to season, brand to brand, and it's substantial, the difference. A very carefully measured recipe made at 3 different times of the year with 2 different kinds of flour may come out completely different. And so what I'm going to suggest to you, and this is one of the best ways I know of mixing together a dough, is start with your liquid ingredients in the mixing bowl like I've done right here. Get your sugar in there, get your yeast in there. Once that's all ready to go, we start adding in the flour and turning that into our dough. And I don't want my dough to be too stiff. Now, I say add more flour slowly because, and this is why, let's say we get to the end of mixing our dough and it's too dry. Folks, adding water to a dough is very, very difficult. It's hard to get it worked in. It mostly just slicks over the outside, and it's hard to get it kneaded in the right way. It takes a long time. But it's much quicker to slowly knead in flour. It works like a charm that way. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to put a part of, but not all of, my flour down in this bowl. I want to reserve maybe a quarter of the flour, knowing that my dough at this point will be too sticky. I will slowly be adding more flour in just a little bit until the dough takes on the right texture. I want it slightly sticky. I want it to slightly stick to my skin, maybe leave a little bit behind on my skin, but I don't want it so sticky that it's not handleable, okay? Plain and simple. Let's get on with mixing. As I mentioned to you earlier that we would put the salt in at a different stage, right now, this is when we go in with that salt. Just let it work its way in from the edge there. I like to do this overhead view because it allows you to see firsthand what the dough is starting to look like. What's its texture, consistency. So you'll know what to look for in your dough as well. Now, I entered about half as much more. I have about a third of a cup, maybe half a cup of my flour left behind. And that right there may make a dough that's just right. We'll take a look at it. Other times I might need to actually measure into it a little bit more flour. That's the thing about making bread. It's a fickle thing. And so that flour, some seasons will absorb more moisture than other seasons. How much rain the wheat got that year, the temperature of the wheat that year, the type of wheat that was used for the flour. All of these things make a big difference in how the flour absorbs moisture. Let's stop. Let's take a look at this now. Okay, let me pull it off of that hook. All right, now it is starting to get a little bit shiny. Doesn't take too long, and it's leaving a little bit of dough on my fingers. See, it's not really bad, but it's just sticky enough to leave just that behind. That's what I'm looking for right there. Moist but not wet, okay? Let's let that knead a little longer. Now if you're kneading this by hand, I want to say somewhere around 5 to 8 minutes probably, or by machine about the same, 4 or 5 minutes. The machine can do the kneading faster. Now folks, this is all about development of gluten, and we're trying to develop the strands of gluten to get a certain quality, and that's what the kneading is about. It gives us that quality. And after the kneading, we then do what we call proofing, and that's where we kind of rise it up. However, I want to mention to you, there was an old way of making bread a long time ago, and it was called autolyzing. Autolyzing is where we mix everything together just like we did right here, except the yeast. We leave the yeast off to the side. We then set the dough aside for a couple of hours to do what's called autolyzing, and that allows the final development of the gluten within the dough before we introduce yeast and then start rising it up. This is how you make dough without having to do all of this mixing and kneading. You just mix the ingredients together and set it aside to let it autolyze. If you've got the extra time, that's a cool method. Otherwise, I recommend doing it this way. On mixing up our dough, we had a little flour left over. I wanted to get an exact amount of flour that was left over there. So let's go do this. Click this and zero this out. There we go. So we're zeroed out. The amount of flour I had left over was 37 grams, ladies and gentlemen. Now the thing of it is there are other times when I might do this same recipe with the exact same amount of flour, use all of the flour, and have a dough that's a little more sticky than I have now. You just never know. Flour is fickle in that way, so be prepared for a little bit of variation both in measuring devices and in the flour itself. Let's take a look at our dough. All right, this has been kneading now for about 5 minutes. And when I look at the outside of that dough, look, I have this nice shiny surface. It's starting to break in a few places, but that's not a big deal. It's been kneading, all right? But I have a wonderful quality. Now, this will improve with rising, okay? So I'm gonna make that even better. Now, if you notice, I've just kind of tucked it all under, pulled it together underneath so it's in a ball, and then drop it in your bowl and let it rise. You don't have to spray the bowl. You can put a little bit of butter in there or some oil to keep it from sticking, or you can just throw it in there and loosen it up with a spatula when it comes time to remove it. In the meantime, cover it, put it in a warm spot, and let it rise, folks. Right now, the yeast will do its thing, and the rise time will depend on a myriad of factors: temperature, altitude, barometric pressure, the yeast that you use, its age, all kinds of stuff. All right, so just be patient. That's all you have to learn. Patience. Let's take a look here. This has been about 40 minutes. All right, so a very short period of time on the whole, but I'm using a fast rising yeast, so it went pretty well. I like to use a silicone spatula. A little scraper can help also. Just pull it out of that bowl. There we go. And what I want to do, knead this just a little bit. It doesn't take a whole lot. And all we have to do is just fold it a few times, okay, and turn it. The whole idea here when we're kneading, we're building the gluten structure in the dough, okay? That's the whole idea behind that. And then we get this nice, beautiful, satiny, smooth finish on the outside, and that's what we're looking for. What you've just seen me do right there is all that's necessary. If you have a dough that is so sticky it takes a little bit of flour, go ahead and knead the flour into it. That's not a problem, and it'll come out just fine. This is really nice because it feels smooth now. Only small amounts are sticking to me, and that is a quality I'm looking for. That means this is coming out just the way I want it. It's going to produce a bread that's going to have a very even crust on the inside. In other words, it'll look very much like when you go purchase a loaf of white bread that's industrial made white bread. Then you will notice that this will have about the same texture as that, very fine crumb. Okay, goes back in the bowl we rose it in the first time. Put the same cover back on, give it plenty of time. That's all there is to it. Bread making is not a difficult thing, and you should not make this a difficult thing. Just knead the dough, throw it back in there, let it rise again, and be patient. That's really the big thing in making bread is patience. Again, we are just now moving up to that 40-minute mark. It's been 39 minutes. This is a count up timer, so that's how long it's been doing its thing here. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out, and we're going to knead it again, and I'm going to get it into the pan that I'm going to rise it in and cook it in right here. When it comes to these things, your loaf pans, even if it's a non-stick, go ahead and spray it. Even on the best of non-sticks, I see them occasionally not measure up to what they're named for. So sometimes non-sticks don't work so well. Okay, we have this. I'm just going to push it out and see what I'm doing there. Kind of a long kind of rectangle shape. That's what I'm going for. Okay, isn't that nice? Very simple dough. Nothing special. And what I want to do here is to take this and just simply roll it. We're just forming a simple cylinder that we're going to rise into our dough. And here on the bottom, if you want to try to kind of pinch that in, that's fine. Sometimes it helps. depending on how dry your dough is. All right. And I find a little bit of that swirl on the end doesn't hurt a thing, so don't worry about it. Okay, there we have it. Our dough is ready to be risen. Again, put it in my pan. Now this time I'm going to cover this with a little bit of plastic wrap, and I'm going to let this thing rise up until it is starting to dome. I'm going to gently remove the plastic wrap at that point because sometimes it'll stick. And if you're worried about that possibility of sticking, right now you can dust it with a little flour, and that helps to reduce that problem. Okay, so let's give it another 40 minutes, right? All right, as I mentioned, a little plastic wrap, place over the top. Now I will again use my count up timer so that you guys can get some idea of how long each step is taking and what is going on there. And this starts with seconds, but as it hits 20 minutes, it then just rolls over, and then we will see how many minutes it's going on. All right, there we go. Again, it's just a matter of patience. We wait and wait and wait, and once this has filled the pan and is doming up, we've got a loaf that's getting ready to go in the oven. When it comes time to preheat that oven, that's going to be preheated to 400 degrees. That's right, 400 on this one. I've just pulled my plastic off of the top of this. We are presently at 46 minutes on this rise time. So with that having been said, the rise on this loaf needs to be just a little bit more, not much. I would say maybe another ½ an inch, and it's going to be looking really pretty. I kind of like on a recipe of this size for this to just start crusting a little bit right here on the edges before I put it in the oven. My bread has now risen in the pan for about 1 hour. Okay, and it's about 2.5 times its original bulk. Okay, so it's ready for the oven. 400 degrees. I'm going to start it at about 20 minutes. We'll check on it at that point. There we go. We're about to get into the ingredients quantities, but something I wanted to discuss with you about the ingredients that we are working with today. When it comes to flour and measuring flour, we measure flour using a scale, okay? The reason we do scale measurement instead of by the cup is because there can be a lot of differences in cups. This says 1 cup, 256 milliliters. This says 1 cup, 250 milliliters, and one of these is vastly wrong, okay? And so here's the thing. Depending on whose recipe you got, depends on which measuring cup they used, and is it right, is it wrong, or all of that. And I want to show you how much difference, okay? So we're going to measure out 3 cups of flour. We're going to do it twice, and we're going to weigh the difference between those two, okay? So the first one starts with this bowl, and I need to zero out my scale, of course, when I put a new bowl on there. So I hit the tar. Okay, so now it has been zeroed out. I will use my regular, and I shouldn't do that. Let me show you something to do. When you're scooping up flour, get it into your measuring cup, scrape off the top first, and to make sure there are no voids, give it a single light tap, just like that. If there's a void in it, flour will drop down into it and let you know you don't have enough there. So we'll do this one. Okay. A little more here. Take it off, 1 tap. 2 cups. And going in for that 3rd one. All right, we're looking good. All right, so I have a total here. Let me set my unit to grams, okay? And I'm going to use grams because it's just more accurate than pounds and ounces, okay? Plain and simple. I have 417 grams in this bowl. Now this is the bowl we're actually going to be using for making this recipe. So we're going to say roughly 400 grams, although I measured up to 417. And here we go. This is where we find out the truth about measuring cups and also about doing volume measurements on large amounts of powder. Okay. Okay, so what I have now is 444 grams in this bowl. All right. So I have a difference of 27 grams. Now, here's the thing. Let's kind of take a look at what that actually kind of looks like. Okay, I want to zero this bowl out. You know, if we're going to be really exacting about it. And that looks to me to be somewhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of a cup if it were to be measured out. I think that's what we would be looking at. And that is enough to seriously throw any recipe off. Okay, so when you are doing your recipes, smart to find a recipe that's measured in grams or in ounces or something like that, to measure by poundage when it comes to that powder. Because frankly, ladies and gentlemen, our measuring cups may not be the same as each other's, okay? So the quantity, as you've already seen on our flour, I'm starting with 417 grams. But as you've seen, it doesn't always boil down to exact numbers on that flour. Let's keep the rest of the ingredients stable though, so we get an even bread, and that's how we do it. So 1 cup of water. On this we have 7 grams of yeast. That's 1 packet of yeast. It's equivalent to 2½ teaspoons. This right here is 1 teaspoon of salt. Right here I have 2 teaspoons of sugar, and that's all there is to it. Basic white bread. Let's take a look at that loaf. This is really cool. All right, this has been in the oven for about 30 minutes. Yeah, we got a good hollow sound on it when you thump it. Nice. Exactly what I'm looking for. Folks, this just needs to cool a little bit. You don't want to burn yourself when cutting it. Other than that, once it does cool down enough to touch, go ahead and enjoy cutting into it and enjoy your bread, because that is going to be an absolutely delicious loaf of bread, guaranteed. Let's take a look at what we got going on right under the surface here. There we are. Isn't that nice? I'll tell you what, had I shortened that cooking time by about, let's say 5 minutes, this would have had a little softer crust. I like that crusty bread, I really do. And wonderful texture on the inside, what they call the crumb. So we have some really nice looking bread going on here. Well, there it is, basic bread. Folks, thank you very much for watching Texas Cooking Today. Ooh, listen to that. Oh, stretchy interior. Yeah. See, when I get that nice kind of spongy feeling, you can tell that gluten had time to develop. It's that extra rise, going from doing 2 rises to 3 really makes a difference. Oh yeah, let me tell you, great bread. Enjoy this recipe. Take what you've learned here today. Use it. Use it to make fancier bread with. Use it to grow this recipe. A lot of stuff you can do here. Just make sure you enjoy it and realize that, hey, it's not that hard. It's pretty simple on the whole. Mix the stuff together, knead it a little bit, give it a few rises, put it in the pan, rise it again, put it in the oven. Boom, bread. Folks, thank you for watching. Do me a favor, take a look in the description box right underneath this. You're going to see some links there. One of them is to the channel, Texas Cooking Today. You're going to see all my other recipes. There's well over 620 recipes there. And also my website, the address is right there. That link is right there. That is S.A.Trotter.com, and it's the home of S.A.Trotter Arts. And S.A.Trotter Arts makes Texas Cooking Today. Folks, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't done so. Click that like button. And if you would also, folks, enjoy your bread. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.